Divided government, whichever its form, first form or second form, is probably going to mean stalemate. It's probably going to mean gridlock. Not a lot gets done. You know what that term gridlock means, right? You ever been stuck in traffic? Traffic doesn't move very much. And somebody says, wow, it's really gridlocked, right? That's the metaphor, right, that you can apply to the legislative process. Nothing gets done. It's all jammed up, right? Now, if that's true, if that's what we should expect in a situation where we have divided government, then what should we expect when we don't have divided government? That is to say, when you have a president and both chambers of Congress in the hands of the same political party. Is it reasonable to assume that you might get a break in that gridlock? That you might actually get some legislation, and maybe significant legislation passed, right? And all I'm asking you then is, if that's the case, maybe we can think of an example of that occurring back in the period from 2009 to 2011. I'm asking you, can you think of any significant legislation that would have been passed during that period that we can attribute to the fact that you had a Democratic president and Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, probably would not have been possible had you not had this situation existing in the 111th Congress. Okay? That, by many people's accounts, is a very significant piece of legislation. Now you have in the 115th Congress, which is the Congress to come, a Republican president and Republican majorities in the House and Senate, and one of the things that they promised us is that they are going to, maybe just as significantly as the passage of Obamacare, they are going to, they say, repeal Obamacare. Right? That's one of their big things that they campaigned on, right? We're going to repeal Obamacare. And I would probably agree that that would probably be as significant as the passage of Obamacare, to repeal it. Okay? It may be harder to do, actually. It may be harder to, even with the Republican majorities, it may be harder to repeal it than to pass it. Okay?
It's kind of impossible because Obamacare is already part of the law.
But if Congress can write a law that enacts health care reform, then it can write new laws that undo it. Right?
Oh, just like, okay, so I asked.
When we talk about repealing a law, it requires the passage of a new law. Does that make sense? Okay. But I think that that's going to be difficult for the Republicans to accomplish. We'll see. There are other times, though, and we're going to take sort of a historical approach here. I'm going to go back in time a little bit. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. We're going to go back in time a little bit here, beginning with the Reconstruction period. I don't remember. Did I show you these numbers last time? I don't remember this coming up in here. We're going to go back to the Reconstruction period. That's the period immediately following the Civil War. Okay, so the Civil War ended in 1865, and the 10-year period from 1865 to 1875 is the period that the historians refer to as Reconstruction. Okay? And I want you to look at these large, very significant Republican majorities that we have in Congress. Okay? We're not talking about 52, 53, 54% majorities here. We're talking about 80%, 82%, 79%, 69%, 77% majorities. These are huge Republican majorities. And what happened as a consequence of these huge Republican majorities in Congress during the Reconstruction period is that you had this very, very ambitious civil rights agenda that was pushed through the Republican-controlled Congress during this period. We're going to talk about that next week in detail, okay? We'll get into the details of that next week in our topic on civil rights. What I'm trying to say to you now is that the passage of the Enforcement Act of 1870, the Ku Klux Klan Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, there's a whole bunch of these that with the Reconstruction Act of 1869, all this legislation, very significant legislation that was passed by Congress during this period, was possible not only because you had unified party government, but because you had these huge Republican majorities. It's not just the fact that the Republican had majorities. There's a difference between having a slim majority and having a significant majority like this. And I think historically, when we've seen these sort of huge majorities, like we're seeing here during the Reconstruction period, that's when you get a significant legislative agenda that's passed, right? A significant legislative achievements that are passed. Look what happens as Reconstruction comes to an end. You can see here in the session of Congress from the 43rd Congress, the 43rd Congress from 1873 to 1875, you have these huge Republican majorities. Look what happens in the following Congress. Those margins start to dwindle, and by the time you get to the 45th Congress, you're back to these very slim margins, right? You know, we talk about today, the media people and Americans generally talk about how divided the country is, right? That, you know, if you look at the new Congress that's coming in, it's roughly 50-50, and look at what happened in the popular vote for the president, that it was roughly 50-50, right? Does anybody know what the final, I have not checked, to be honest with you, but does anybody know what the final vote totals were for president? I'm not asking you for the actual numbers, I'm asking you for how close it was. Because the last report that I saw that I paid attention, what?
228 to 279.
But they still
I'm not-
called Michigan.
That is close, but I'm not talking about the electoral vote. I'm talking about the popular vote. Okay? Out of the, how many ever, you know,
I don't think they've even called Michigan yet because they have to take those votes out. But they said so far she's up like 300,000 in the popular, but they still haven't finished because they haven't called Michigan as of yesterday afternoon.
right, that's the
Yeah, the
last number
last
that I
that-
heard, is that it was about 300,000 votes difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Now that's a close election. Out of the millions of votes that were cast nationwide, like 100 million votes that were cast nationwide, they're separated by about 200, 300,000. Okay, so everybody knows we have this very closely divided country. It's roughly 50-50, right? But what I'm telling you is we act like that somehow is unique, right? That's somehow just something that's very, it's just about what's going on right now. I'm trying to tell you that is really a scenario that has existed very often in our history. Look at this. Before I go to the next period, which is going to be the period just following the 72nd Congress, look at this split. In 1931, 1932, 1933 period, you have a 50-50 split in the House and in the Senate. All right? So 2016 is not the first time we've observed this very closely divided sort of thing. But look what happens in the very next Congress. Look at this. In the 73rd Congress, the Democrats have huge majorities in both the House and the Senate. They get even bigger in the 74th Congress and in the 75th Congress. Look at that. Okay? Okay? Now, this is the period of the Great Depression. And in the election of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, became president, and the Democrats swept into Congress with these huge legislative majorities. And what is the great legislative achievement of this era? What was Franklin Roosevelt's plan for the plan to fix the Depression, right, was the New Deal, right? But remember when you took your history class and you learned about the New Deal? But how was the New Deal, in what form did it come? Well, it came through all of these acts of Congress that were passed during this period. And I'm telling you, what I'm trying to illustrate to you is that that's only possible when you have, number one, unified party government, the same party in the White House and both chambers of Congress, and when the legislative majorities are huge, as we see here, where the Democrats have these huge majorities. Not this 50-50 split kind of stuff, right? And then the next period that I want to draw your attention to comes at the end of the 1950s into the 1960s. In the 1960 presidential election, John F. Kennedy was elected president, and you have these huge Democratic majorities that we start seeing in the House and the Senate. But particularly in the 1964 election, when Lyndon Johnson became president, okay, and you have these huge Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. I'm talking about this period right here, okay? This is the period of the Great Society, right? And the legislative achievements during the Great Society era are not inconsequential. I mean, you have programs, that laws that are passed during this period that still affect tremendously how people live in 2016, right? I mean, not only in terms of the income security programs that were set up. For example, this is the period where the food stamps program was set up, okay? Or they don't call it food stamps anymore. They call it SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Agricultural Program, or something like that. But originally it was called food stamps. So that, in addition to that, all of the civil rights legislation that comes out during this period, which we're going to talk about next week. The second Congressional Civil Rights Agenda. So, for example, the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Huge, huge accomplishment. The 1965 Voting Rights Act. Huge. Okay? The Civil Rights Act of 1968. Very significant legislation. Other things that are passed through Congress during this period, and again, I'm suggesting to you, probably only possible because you have the unified party government and with these huge legislative majorities. So, to wrap this point up, what I'm trying to say to you then is that the natural or ordinary condition of Congress is to be fragmented and to have divided government and gridlock, right? But there are these episodes that we have from time to time in our history where you get the presidency and both chambers of Congress that are captured by the same political party, and you get these huge legislative majorities, and it's in those instances when we see these historical, major dramatic shifts and departures in public policy. Okay? So I think what Professor Fenno would say is that the fragmentation of Congress can be overcome, but it's going to be episodic at best. It's only going to happen in episodes, and when it does happen, it can only happen if you have the unifying influence of political party. Okay? So political parties are one way to overcome this fragmentation of power that we're talking about in Congress. All right, so questions about that point?